They say time heals all wounds, but what if time only makes the truth heavier? Some secrets aren't buried, they're carried, year after year, until they become part of you. What would it take for you to finally set one free? Follow this channel, because the story you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty. The metallic clink rang out like a shot in the tense stillness of the operating room. Every head turned toward the sound. Dr. Andrew Carter froze for a fraction of a second, his gloved hands hovering over the open incision in the patient's back. The harsh overhead lights caught the glint of something small, hard, and metallic, buried deep within the scarred tissue. His heart gave a quick, sharp thud. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. "It's a bullet." The words seemed to hang in the sterile air, heavy and incomprehensible. A nurse, leaning in for a better look, drew in a sharp breath. "Bullet? How?" But she didn't finish the sentence, because in that moment the monitor's beeping changed, the tone flattening into a steady alarm. "Blood pressure dropping," the anesthesiologist barked. 85/50 and falling. "Pulse ox down to 82%, another voice called. "He's going into shock." Carter's focus snapped back to the task at hand. "We need to stabilize him. Now. Push another 500 of fluids. Prep the epinephrine." He worked quickly, fighting to keep his mind clear even as adrenaline surged. The bullet was only the beginning of the questions piling up in his head. He could feel them pressing against his concentration like an incoming tide. How long had it been there? Why hadn't it been removed? And how was the man lying unconscious before him, David Miller, still alive? The answer to that last question was a mystery for later. Right now, the priority was keeping him alive long enough to find out. The aura faded, not in reality, but in the consciousness of the man on the table. Beneath the anesthesia, David Miller's mind was wandering, pulled somewhere else entirely. In the darkness behind his eyelids, there was wind, hot, gritty, relentless. It roared in his ears and stung his skin like tiny blades. His hands clutched a rifle slick with sand and sweat. Visibility was gone, swallowed in a swirling chaos of yellow and brown. Somewhere through the wind, a voice shouted orders, muffled by the storm. Then came the sound, short bursts of gunfire, close, too close, followed by a sharp impact between his shoulder blades as if a giant fist had slammed into him. In the dream, he stumbled but didn't fall. There was no time. The mission came first. 3 weeks earlier, the only storm David faced was the mild Atlantic breeze rolling over the Gulf Coast. His home, a modest one-story house 3 blocks from the shore in St. Petersburg, Florida, was neat and almost military in its order. The lawn was trimmed with the precision of a parade ground, the American flag on its pole clean and perfectly lit at night. Inside, the furniture was simple, practical, and arranged with the same quiet discipline. It was the kind of house that spoke not of wealth but of self-reliance. David, 67 years old, was as much a part of the neighborhood's rhythm as the tide itself. Every morning, he was up before the sun, making a pot of black coffee and sitting on the porch while the horizon shifted from purple to gold. He rarely missed his walk along the beach, even in cooler weather, his long, steady stride a reminder of years spent in uniform. The neighbors waved, he nodded in return. Conversation rarely went beyond polite greetings. That was the way he liked it. His living room walls bore the quiet testimony of a life lived in service, a shadow box of medals, a folded flag from a fellow Marine's funeral, a few photographs of his late wife, Linda, whose smile could still soften the edges of his memory. There was one photograph of a young Rachel, no older than 10, standing proudly next to him in his dress blues. It was the only picture of them together in uniform, taken before the years and the distance grew between them. It was 3 years ago that he first noticed the lump, small, hard, just below his right shoulder blade. It didn't hurt at first, and so he ignored it. He'd chalked it up to a knot in the muscle, an old injury resurfacing, but over the years it grew, not dramatically, just enough that it sometimes caught against his shirt when he moved in certain ways. Lately, though, it had been different. The ache had sharpened, and there were moments when it sent a streak of pain down his arm. He'd thought about mentioning it during his yearly checkups at the VA clinic, but the idea always died on his tongue. Marines didn't complain about aches and pains. They endured. That morning, the sun was just beginning to lift when David reached for the coffee tin on the top shelf of his kitchen cabinet. The motion sent a sudden bolt of pain shooting from the lump down his spine, sharp enough to make his fingers go slack. The ceramic mug in his hand slipped, shattering against the tile floor. "Damn it," he muttered, gripping the counter until the black spots in his vision cleared. He stayed still for a long moment, willing the pain to ebb back to its usual dull throb. When it finally did, he knelt to pick up the shards of the mug, moving with deliberate care. Later, on his walk along the beach, the pain returned in waves, forcing him to stop every 100 yards to catch his breath. A young couple jogging past glanced at him with concern. He straightened his back and kept walking, unwilling to look weak. By the time he returned home, the sky was turning overcast, the wind carrying the smell of rain. The phone rang, its familiar tone breaking the quiet. It was Rachel. "Hey, Dad," she said. "How's Florida?" "Can't complain," he replied automatically, shifting in his recliner to ease the pressure on his back. A sharp twinge escaped into his voice before he could stop it. "Are you okay?" she asked, suspicion sharpening her tone. "What was that?" "Just a little backache. Nothing worth fussing over." "Dad, you never admit pain unless it's serious. Remember when you had pneumonia and told me it was a little cough? What's really going on?" David hesitated, staring out the window at the gathering storm clouds. "There's a lump on my back. Been there a while." "How long is a while?" "A couple of years, maybe." There was a long-waited pause. "Years? Dad, that's not nothing. Have you had it checked?" "No point. Some young doctor's just gonna tell me I'm old." Her frustration was palpable even across the line. "Either you make an appointment, or I'm flying down there myself." He didn't answer right away. The rain began to tap against the window, a steady, insistent sound. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll call." He didn't call that day. Or the next. It was only after the pain woke him in the middle of the night, sharp, hot, relentless, that he finally picked up the phone and scheduled an appointment at the VA clinic. The VA clinic smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as David sat on the edge of the exam table, the paper crinkling beneath him. A physician's assistant took his vitals, then stepped out, leaving the door cracked. When Dr. Andrew Carter walked in, tall, mid-40s, a face that had seen more than it said, David straightened without thinking, a reflex as old as boot camp. "Mr. Miller," the doctor said, glancing at the chart. 67. Prior service Marine Corps. He met David's eyes. "You picked the wrong branch if you didn't want back problems." "Comes with the uniform," David said. "Tell me about the lump." "Been there a few years, got bigger, hurts sometimes." Carter's hands were efficient and respectful as he palpated the area between David's shoulder blades. He stopped, pressed, changed angle, pressed again. "You've got a fair amount of scarred tissue around this," he said, almost to himself. "Any known trauma there?" "Nothing I'd call known," David said. Carter didn't smile. He stepped back. "I'm ordering imaging. Ultrasound first. If it's inconclusive, we'll do CT or MRI. I don't like surprises in this neighborhood." He tapped the chart where he'd marked T3, T4. The ultrasound technician was quick, professional, and close-mouthed. She slowed at one pass, shifted the probe, slowed again. "Hold still for me," she murmured. David did. She took more images than seemed necessary, and left to check with the doctor, a phrase that sank like weight in his stomach. They sent him for CT. He lay still as the machine whispered and clicked around him, cool air moving across his face, the table sliding in and out on rails. He thought of the cold metal of a rifle, of dust in his mouth. He thought of nothing at all. Carter called him into a small consultation room with a computer monitor and a plastic anatomical spine on the shelf. He swiveled the screen toward David. The grayscale image wasn't easy to read, but even a layman could pick out the bright, hard shape embedded in softer tissue. It wasn't perfectly round. It was too regular to be bone. It sat too close to the spine. "This," Carter said, tapping the screen with a capped pen, "isn't typical of a lipoma or cyst. It's denser. Could be metal, could be a fragment. It's surrounded by calcified tissue and inflammation." "Shrapnel?" David asked, the word landing flat. "Possibly." Carter's voice stayed even, "but the shape is consistent with a small caliber projectile. I can't be certain without better imaging. I'd like an MRI to assess proximity to the cord." "I thought we already did the fancy one," David said. "That was CT. MRI gives me a better look at soft tissue." Carter hesitated. "Given location and signs of infection, I want to move quickly. If this is a foreign body, it's likely been there a long time. The tissue around it is breaking down." "Breaking down," David repeated, as if trying the phrase on his tongue. "It can happen after years of the body walling something off. Then the wall fails. That's when people get sick." He paused. "You served. Did you ever take fire, blast exposure, falls?" David's mind slid to sand and shouting and a sudden blow between the shoulders. He closed the door on it. Everyone took something, one way or another. Carter studied him for a beat, then nodded once. I'll have my scheduler push this through. If the MRI confirms what I think, we'll refer you to Walter Reed for surgical removal. You'll be in good hands there. David left with a folder of orders and the doctor's card in his pocket. The afternoon heat leaned hard on the parking lot. He walked out into it, the sun flaring in the chrome of windshields, the smell of asphalt and cut grass thick in the air. He told himself he'd call Rachel after he got home, after he'd had coffee, after the ache settled. He told himself a lot of things. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Rachel's name lit the screen. He answered without looking. Hey. How did it go? She asked, the words tight, as if bracing for impact. They took pictures, he said. Doctor wants more. More what? More pictures. Dad. He took a breath that didn't quite make it to his lungs. He thinks it might be metal. Silence. He could hear her exhale. From what? Couldn't say. When is the MRI? Soon. Define soon. I'm walking to the car, he said, as if that were an answer. The distance between him and the sedan seemed longer than when he'd crossed it earlier. His vision edged with gray, then cleared, then narrowed again. Dad? Rachel's voice sharpened. Are you okay? You sound… He didn't hear the rest. The world tilted gently and then all at once. The folder slipped from his hand, paper skittering across the blacktop like startled birds. The sun, the cars, the white lines underfoot, everything slid sideways. He felt the familiar blow between his shoulders again, except this time it came from inside, a hard cramp of pain that took his knees away. As he fell, someone shouted. Hands caught at his elbow. The sky wheeled overhead, white hot. For a second he thought he saw dust, the kind that grinds down into your teeth and doesn't leave. Then the world snapped to black. When he opened his eyes, he was staring at a ceiling tile. A face resolved into focus above him, the physician's assistant from earlier, hair in a tight bun, eyes steady. You fainted in the lot, she said, her voice calm but fast. Do you know where you are? Va, he said. Good. Don't try to sit up. She glanced at the monitor beside the gurney. We're going to keep you for observation until your pressure stabilizes. Phone, he said. My daughter. It's right here, she said, lifting it. It's been ringing. He took it and pressed call. Rachel picked up on the first half ring. Dad? I'm okay, he lied on reflex. I sat down the wrong way. You fainted. It wasn't a question. Put a nurse on the phone. He held the phone out. The PA took it, listened, answered with the competent, precise language of medicine. When she handed it back, Rachel's voice was clipped with action. I'm booking a flight tonight. I'll be there in the morning. You don't… I'm coming, she said. We'll do this together. He closed his eyes. He wanted to tell her not to worry. He wanted to tell her he'd handled worse alone. He wanted, and for once the wanting felt heavier than the words he usually used to hold it off. All right, he said quietly. By the time Rachel stepped off a pre-dawn plane in Tampa, David was back home with instructions, 2 new prescriptions, and a bruise on his pride. She drove the rental car like a woman with a mission, jaw set, eyes scanning for the fastest lane. When she walked into his kitchen, she didn't hug him right away. She looked him over from boots to brow, assessing like a medic. Only then did she step forward and wrap her arms around him, hard and brief. You look tired, she said. You look like you haven't slept, he countered. Then we match. She put a folder on the table, the same one he dropped in the parking lot, now taped and squared. We're going to Walter Reed. Dr. Carter's notes are already there. He opened his mouth. She raised a hand. You can argue later, she said, softer than the words. Please. He looked at her, really looked, past the efficient edges, into the worry she wasn't hiding. The house hummed around them, the old refrigerator kicking on, the wind fingering the flag out front. For years he had carried what he carried and called it strength. In the quiet kitchen with his daughter's hand still resting on the folder, he felt something else, the shape of a different kind of strength, one that asked for help and didn't break. Okay, he said. Walter Reed. They sat for a long beat with the decision between them like a third-place setting. Outside the sky began to lighten and the first birds started up. Rachel poured coffee, black for him, cream for herself, and took out a notepad. Flights, she said, already writing. Med records. Hotel near the hospital. I'll call your neighbor to check on the house. Don't make this a campaign, he said. It's just logistics, Dad. She looked up and gave him a small, tired smile. The mission comes first, right? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the words were a bridge, The morning of their departure came with the restless weight of too little sleep. David packed light, just a small duffel with a change of clothes, his toiletry kit, and a worn leather wallet that had traveled with him through more than 2 decades in the Marines. Rachel arrived with her own bag, a folder of documents, and a printout of their itinerary. She moved through his house like a quiet storm, checking locks, straightening the stack of mail on the counter, unplugging the coffee maker. The drive to Tampa International was hushed except for the occasional update from Rachel: boarding time, gate number, estimated arrival in Washington. David nodded at each one without comment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He had the look of a man who'd already traveled 1,000 miles in his head before the car ever left the driveway. At the airport, security was slow, the lines long with spring break travelers. David's patience thinned, though he said nothing. When the TSA officer asked him to remove his belt, he hesitated, remembering the last time he'd been ordered to strip anything off his person. Then he exhaled and did as asked, moving through the metal detector without setting it off. On the plane, they sat side by side in an exit row, Rachel by the window, David on the aisle. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. He adjusted his seat, wincing as the fabric of his shirt caught on the lump beneath his shoulder blade. "You okay?" Rachel asked, eyes still on the view outside. "Fine." She let it go, though her hands tightened around the coffee cup in her lap. Midway through the flight, David's gaze drifted to the clouds outside. They were thick, white masses rolling beneath them, but in his mind's eye, they were tinted gold and brown, swirling in a furious wind. He could almost taste the grit in his mouth, feel the sting in his eyes. The faint vibration of the plane became the distant rattle of gunfire. His grip tightened on the armrest until the cloudscape dissolved and he was back in his seat, breath steady but shallow. They landed at Reagan National under a thin veil of gray sky. The wind off the Potomac carried the bite of early spring. Rachel guided them through the terminal with brisk efficiency, her boots clicking against the tile. Outside, a taxi ferried them through the narrow streets toward Bethesda. The city slid past in muted colors, government buildings with stern facades, cherry trees still weeks from bloom, commuters in dark coats and quick strides. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center rose like a fortress, its modern glass and steel reflecting the low clouds. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Uniformed personnel moved with quiet purpose through the wide corridors. At the check-in desk, a young corpsman greeted them with a polite smile and directed them to radiology. Dr. Carter met them outside the MRI suite. He wore a white coat over navy scrubs, his ID badge clipped at an angle. "Mr. Miller," he said, offering a firm handshake. "Good to see you made it in." "Not much of a tourist trip," David replied. Carter's smile was brief. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." Inside his office, Carter pulled up the MRI scans on a dual monitor. The images rotated in slow, precise increments. Slices of David's spine revealed in stark contrasts of black, gray, and white. Carter pointed to a bright shape nestled near the vertebral column, its edges clean and unnatural. "This is the foreign body," he said. "Metallic density. Approximate length 22 millimeters. It's sitting less than a centimeter from the spinal cord. The surrounding tissue shows signs of chronic inflammation. You've got scar tissue from what looks like an old wound. Very old." Rachel leaned forward. "Could it have been there for decades?" Carter nodded. "Easily. The body can wall off metal for a long time, but over time that wall weakens. That's what's happening here. The inflammation's increasing. If infection sets in, it could reach the spinal cord or bloodstream." David stared at the image without speaking. To him it looked like nothing more than a sliver of bright bone, but he knew bone didn't reflect like that. He knew it was something else entirely, though he wasn't ready to give it a name. "I recommend surgery as soon as possible," Carter said. "We'll need to go in carefully. Any damage to the cord could have serious consequences. I've already reserved an OR for tomorrow." Rachel's eyes flicked to David. "Tomorrow's good." David said nothing for a long beat. Then, "Do what you have to." After the consult, they walked the short distance to the on-site lodging for families. The Fisher house was warm and bright, its common room lined with overstuffed chairs and shelves of books donated by volunteers. Rachel checked them in, collected their keys, and led the way to a small, clean room with 2 twin beds, a dresser, and a window overlooking a courtyard. David sat on the bed, his duffel at his feet. "Place feels quiet." "It's for families," Rachel said. "People stay here when someone's in the hospital, keeps them close." That night, Rachel woke to the sound of her father's voice. It was low at first, almost a murmur, then sharper, more urgent. She turned in bed and saw him thrashing lightly, tangled in the thin blanket. "Sandstorm, get down," he said, the words rough and raw, his face twisted as if against wind and grit. She sat up. "Dad." His eyes snapped open, wild for a moment before settling. He looked at her, the fog of sleep and something older lifting slowly. "Just a dream," he said. Rachel studied him in the dim light. Sounded like more than that. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Dreams are like old movies, Rachel. They skip, they lie." She wanted to press, but the set of his shoulders told her he was already retreating behind walls built long ago. So she lay back down, listening to the silence return, broken only by the soft hum of the heater. Somewhere beyond these walls, a bullet sat waiting to be pulled from her father's body. Somewhere in his past, there was another storm she hadn't yet seen. Morning came wrapped in a low gray sky, the kind that seemed to press against the windows. David dressed in the loose hospital gown they'd given him, its ties awkward at the back, the fabric smelling faintly of bleach. Rachel walked beside him down the corridor to the surgical wing, her hand hovering just short of his elbow, ready if he stumbled. In the pre-op bay, the air was cool, the fluorescent light stark. Nurses moved with quick precision, checking his wristband, confirming his name and date of birth, asking when he'd last eaten. Dr. Carter appeared at the foot of the bed, mask hanging loose around his neck. "Morning, Mr. Miller. We'll have you in the OR shortly. The anesthesia team will take care of you. Any questions?" David shook his head. "Just get it out." Carter's eyes flicked to Rachel, who gave a small nod. "We'll take good care of him." They wheeled him toward the operating room. The bright, cold space greeted him with stainless steel surfaces, trays of instruments gleaming under the lights. As the anesthesiologist placed the mask over his face, David breathed in the chemical scent. The ceiling began to drift away, replaced by something else entirely. The roar of wind, sand biting at his skin, the weight of a rifle in his hands. He was back in Kuwait, February 1991. The sky was the color of mustard, the storm turning day into a kind of churning twilight. Visibility was less than 10 feet. His squad moved in a staggered line, each man a shadow in the dust. Over the radio, static shredded every word except fragments. Contact, left flank, hold position, then gunfire. Short bursts, close, from somewhere behind. David turned, but the storm was a wall. A blow slammed into his upper back, hard, sudden, like being hit with a sledgehammer. His knees buckled. He sucked in air and tasted grit. "Corporal, you hit?" someone shouted, voice muffled by the storm. "I'm fine," he barked back, straightening. The mission wasn't over. Pain could wait. The flashback shattered as the anesthesia pulled him under completely. In the present, Carter's voice was calm but taut. Incision along the paraspinal line, slow dissection through scar tissue. The scalpel traced a careful path, parting skin and muscle that had long since fused into dense, fibrous layers. "There it is," Carter murmured. A glint of something dull and metallic emerged from the shadows of the wound. He switched to fine-tipped forceps, easing it free. It was a bullet, 5.56 millimeters, jacket tarnished but intact, its tip flattened slightly from impact. He held it up to the light for a moment before placing it in a sterile container. "BP's dropping," the anesthesiologist warned. 70/40. Clamp, suction. "Let's move," Carter ordered. The room shifted into a higher gear, voices crisp, instruments passing from hand to hand. They controlled the bleeding, flushed the wound, and began the slow process of closing. When it was over, Carter stepped out to find Rachel in the waiting area. Her hands were clenched around a styrofoam cup gone cold. "He's stable," Carter said. "We removed a bullet that's been in there for decades. I'm sending it for ballistic testing to see if we can identify the source. There's some infection. We've started antibiotics." "A bullet?" Rachel echoed, the word foreign in her mouth. "Not shrapnel. A bullet. We'll know more once we get the ballistics report." She stared at him. "Do you think it's from combat?" Carter's gaze held hers. Given its position and the age of the scarring, yes. But the specifics, who fired it, when, how, it's too early to say. Rachel nodded, but her mind was already spinning. A bullet meant someone had pulled a trigger. Somewhere in her father's past, there was a moment no one had spoken about in 30 years. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of the recovery room, David drifted in and out of shallow sleep. His breathing was steady, the monitors pulsing in soft green light. Beside him, on the chart clipped to bed, a small label read, "Specimen, projectile." 5.56 millimeters. Sent to ballistics lab, Quantico. 2 days later, the sky over Bethesda was washed clean by an early spring rain. Rachel sat in the family lounge, her laptop open on the low table, a pile of printed documents at her elbow. She'd been up since before dawn, scrolling through military archives, scanning declassified reports from the Gulf War. Most of the files were terse, clinical, dates, unit numbers, mission summaries. But the details were there if you knew how to read them. When Dr. Carter stepped in, she closed the laptop halfway, as if she'd been caught looking somewhere she shouldn't. He carried a manila folder under his arm. "I've got preliminary ballistics," he said, taking a seat across from her. "The projectile's a 5.56 by 45 millimeter NATO round, standard issue for U.S. forces. The rifling marks suggest it came from an M16, a 2 or M4 carbine. That narrows it to, well, most of the Army and Marine Corps in 1991. Rachel felt her throat tighten. "So, it's American." Carter nodded slowly. "It's not impossible for foreign forces to use captured ammo, but the odds here are low." The lab cross-referenced the markings with known manufacturing batches from that period. This one was part of a shipment distributed to several units during Operation Desert Storm, February specifically. Her mind was already moving ahead. "Do you know which units?" "That's where it gets tricky," he said. "The records are still partly restricted. You'd need to file a FOIA request or," he hesitated, "find someone with access." Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the muted television in the corner. The screen showed a scrolling ticker of unrelated news, markets, weather, politics, but she wasn't seeing any of it. She was seeing the single line she'd read in one of those reports, February 25, 1991, incident during sandstorm near Al-Jara. Friendly fire suspected. No casualties reported. No casualties. And yet here was her father, 3 decades later, with a bullet in his back. When she went to see him that afternoon, he was sitting upright in bed, a thin blanket across his legs. The lines in his face looked deeper, but his eyes were clear. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been reading," she replied, setting her laptop bag on the chair. "Desert storm reports, sandstorms, engagements near Kuwait City." He gave a small grunt, non-committal. "There was an incident," she said, watching his face. "Friendly fire, February 25th. They said there were no casualties." David's gaze dropped to the blanket. He picked at a loose thread with the care of a man diffusing something volatile. "Paper says a lot of things. Was it you?" The silence stretched between them, not quite hostile but heavy. Finally he shook his head, not in denial but in refusal to answer. "Does it matter now?" "It matters to me," Rachel said. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge. "Because whoever fired that shot, it was someone wearing the same uniform you wore, and you've carried it, literally, for the rest of your life." His jaw tightened. "You think I haven't figured that out?" "I think you've never said it out loud." For a moment she thought he might tell her, might pull the curtain back on that day, the wind, the gunfire. Instead, he reached for the remote and clicked on the muted television. Rachel didn't push further, but as she left his room, her mind was already turning over options. She knew there were other men who had been there, men who might talk if she asked the right way. And there was one name she'd stumbled across more than once in those reports, a lieutenant who had later risen high in politics, now sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Mark Evans. She repeated the name in her head as she walked down the corridor, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the tile. Somewhere between 1991 and now, the truth had been buried. But she had the feeling it wouldn't stay that way much longer. Rachel started with the names she'd found in the after-action reports, men who'd served in the same sector during the last week of February 1991. Some were just initials, others full names buried in lists of commendations or logistics transfers. She began calling the ones she could track down, leaving messages when she got voicemail. The first to answer was a retired gunnery sergeant named Wallace, now living in Arizona. His voice was gravel, like a road that had seen too many storms. When she explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a long pause on the line. "Ma'am," he said finally, "there's stuff from that storm day that people were told to forget. Best thing you can do is let it stay that way." "I'm not looking to embarrass anyone," Rachel said. "I just want to know what happened to my father." "That's the problem," Wallace replied. "The truth won't embarrass. It'll ruin, and not just for one man, for a lot of us." Before she could press him, he hung up. The next name on her list, a former corporal named Jimenez, picked up after the third ring. He listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "Your dad saved my life. That's all I can tell you." The rest. There are men still serving, still in the fight, and bringing this up would burn them down. You understand?" Rachel understood the words but not the logic. She hung up and sat staring at her notes, each call turning into a dead end. That evening, she sat in the hospital cafeteria with her laptop open, combing through more articles. She found a piece from 15 years ago, an interview with then-Congressman Mark Evans, a decorated Desert Storm veteran, now a senior senator. In the photo, his hair was silver at the temples, his smile practiced but warm. The caption mentioned that he'd commanded a platoon during Operation Desert Storm. In the body of the article, one paragraph caught her attention. During a fierce sandstorm, then Lieutenant Evans led his men to safety under enemy fire. His actions saved several lives, though he modestly declines to discuss the details. Rachel read it twice, then a third time. The dates matched, the location matched, and the silence matched. The same selective memory she'd heard in every voice that had taken her call. Back in her father's room, she found him awake, leafing through a paperback someone had left on the side table. "I think I know who might have answers," she said. David looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who?" "Mark Evans. He was there. He's in the Senate now." For a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or caution. That's a man with a lot to lose. Then maybe he'll want to set the record straight. David shook his head. Or maybe he'll make sure the record stays exactly how it is. Rachel leaned on the foot of the bed. "I can't keep pretending this was just bad luck. If he knows something, I'm going to find out." His gaze held hers, steady and hard. "Be careful, Rachel. Truth's not always a gift." She straightened. "It's still worth having." Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the window in a steady rhythm. Rachel felt the decision settle in her chest like a stone. She would find a way to reach Senator Evans. Whatever doors she had to knock on, whatever records she had to pull, she would do it. As she left the room, David closed his eyes, the weight of old memories pressing down. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the storm was still blowing, the sand still biting, and the sharp crack of a rifle still echoing through the wind. Rachel started with the official route. She called the number listed on Senator Evans's public website, a Washington office line answered by a young voice that sounded like it had been trained to block unwanted conversations. "This is the office of Senator Mark Evans," the aide said. "My name's Rachel Miller," she began, careful to keep her voice calm but firm. "My father served under him during Desert Storm. I'd like to request a short meeting." There was a pause, the faint sound of typing. "And the nature of the meeting? It concerns an incident during the Gulf War," she said. Another pause. "This one longer? I'm afraid the senator's schedule is full for the foreseeable future. If you'd like to send us a written inquiry, we'll be happy to review it." She tried twice more over the next week, each time hitting the same polite stone wall. On the third attempt, the aide's tone had a faint edge. "If this is a matter related to classified operations, the senator is not able to comment. Please refrain from further calls on this subject." Rachel ended the call with her jaw tight. The direct route was closed. She needed another door. That night, back at the Fisher house, she scrolled through her phone until she found the number of someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Emily Chen, a journalist she'd known in college who had gone on to cover defense and veterans affairs. Emily answered on the second ring. "Rachel? Wow, it's been forever. What's up?" "I need a favor," Rachel said, then told her the short version, the bullet, the surgery, the ballistics, the dead-end calls to Evans's office. Emily listened without interrupting. When Rachel finished, there was a long exhale. "That's a lot. And you think Evans was directly involved?" "I think he was there, and I think he knows exactly what happened." Emily's voice shifted into professional mode. "He's careful, but he does grant the occasional off-record sit-down, usually to veterans or their families. If I put in a request framing it as part of a human interest piece on Desert Storm survivors, he might bite. No promises." 3 days later, Emily called back. "He's agreed to 20 minutes. In person, off the record. You, me, and him in his D.C. office. He thinks it's about your father's recovery story." Rachel's pulse kicked. "When?" "Tomorrow at 10. Don't waste time warming up. He'll control the clock." The next morning, they walked through the marbled halls of the Russell Senate office building, past staffers with clipboards and visitors clutching maps. Evans' suite was polished and formal, with flags in the corner and framed commendations on the walls. He was waiting behind a broad desk, silver hair immaculate, a tie in the deep red of power and intent. His handshake was firm, his smile just shy of warm. "Ms. Miller," he said, motioning toward the chairs. "Emily tells me your father's been through quite an ordeal." Rachel sat, meeting his gaze directly. He has, and I think you were there at the beginning of it. The smile thinned but didn't disappear. Is that so? For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tick of the clock on the credenza. Rachel felt the weight of his attention, the practiced stillness of a man used to controlling the field. Whether it was a battlefield or a Senate hearing, this was not going to be a polite exchange of memories. It was already something sharper. Evans leaned back in his chair, folding his hands loosely in front of him. I've met a lot of Marines over the years, Ms. Miller. What makes you think I remember one particular man from 3 decades ago? Rachel didn't flinch, because the reports say there were no casualties during the sandstorm outside Al-Jarrah on February 25, 1991, and yet my father carried a 5.56mm NATO round in his back until last week. For the first time, the senator's eyes flickered. Just a fraction, but enough for her to see the recognition. He reached for a pen on his desk, tapping it once against his blotter before setting it down again. I know the storm you're talking about, he said finally. Visibility was near zero. We were moving in staggered columns trying to link up with another unit. Confusion like that. He trailed off, shaking his head. People see shapes in the dust. Sometimes they fire. Sometimes they fire at their own, Rachel said. Evans' gaze sharpened. You're not accusing me, are you? I'm asking if you pulled the trigger. A muscle worked in his jaw. No, but I was there when it happened, and I remember a Marine, tall, broad-shouldered, who went down and got back up like nothing had touched him. He waved us on, kept moving. That man saved my squad from walking straight into an enemy position. Rachel's breath caught. That was my father, I figured. Evans's voice was quieter now, almost measured. We got turned around in that storm. The rounds that hit him came from behind us, from our own lines. I don't know who fired them, and I never asked. The CO's report said no casualties, and no one was eager to correct him. Why not? He hesitated, then said, because admitting it would have meant court-martials, maybe prison, and a black mark on every man in that chain of command. We just won a war in 100 hours. Nobody wanted a scandal to rewrite the story. Rachel felt heat rising in her chest. So you all just let him carry it, literally. For 30 years Evans met her eyes, and for the first time there was something like regret in his expression. Your father didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to finish the mission and go home. If you think he didn't know exactly what hit him, you're underestimating him. She leaned forward. Then give me names. Someone must have been close enough to see. Evans was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He flipped to a page near the back and tore it out, folding it once before sliding it across the desk. That's the only man who might still talk, he said, if he's alive. Rachel unfolded the paper. A name, a last known address in North Carolina, and nothing else. She looked up. Why are you giving me this? Evan's expression was unreadable again. Because you're not going to stop, and maybe you deserve to hear it from someone who was there, instead of piecing it together from scraps. Emily, who had been silent until now, glanced at Rachel. We should go. The senator's got other meetings. Evans stood, offering his hand. Rachel didn't take it right away. When she finally did, his grip was firm, but she could feel the weight in it, a man carrying something he couldn't put down, even after all these years. As they left the office, the folded slip of paper felt heavy in her pocket. Somewhere in North Carolina, there was another piece of the puzzle, and she was going to find it. Rachel left D.C. the next morning, renting a car at Reagan and pointing it south toward the Carolina coast. The slip of paper from Evans was folded neatly in her jacket pocket, the name Master Sergeant Thomas Grady, written in a tight military hand. Beside it was a last known address in a small town outside Jacksonville, not far from Camp Lejeune. The highway rolled out in long gray ribbons under a sky still heavy with late winter clouds. She drove for hours, the radio low, her mind turning over everything Evans had said and everything he hadn't. She imagined her father in that storm, the chaos of men firing at shadows, and the years he'd spent carrying both the bullet and the silence. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, the light was fading. Grady's address led her down a 2-lane road bordered by pines, their needles hissing in the wind. His house was small, set back from the road, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A faded Marine Corps flag hung limp beside the door. She knocked twice. Footsteps shuffled inside before the door opened a few inches. The man who looked out was in his 70s, his frame still broad under a flannel shirt. His eyes were pale and sharp, and they took her in with a quick, assessing glance. "Grady?" she asked. "Who's asking?" "Rachel Miller." My father is David Miller. We served in—" She caught herself. "You served with him?" Desert Storm. The door didn't open any wider. "I don't do reunions. I'm not here for a reunion. I'm here because my father had surgery last week. They pulled a bullet out of his back. A bullet that was fired during that sandstorm outside Al-Jara." Grady's gaze didn't waver, but his hand tightened on the edge of the door. "Not my problem." "It is if you were there," Rachel said. "Senator Evans gave me your name." That earned her a snort. Figures. He never did like getting his own hands dirty. "Please," Rachel said. "I'm not looking to drag anyone into court. I just need to know what happened. For him. For me." Something in her voice must have landed, because Grady sighed, stepped back, and pushed the door open. "You've got 5 minutes." Inside, the living room smelled faintly of tobacco and old wood. A stack of yellowing newspapers sat on the coffee table beside a half-finished crossword. Grady motioned to a chair but didn't sit himself. Instead, he paced slowly, like a man working up to something. "You want to know about that day?" he said. "It was hell. Couldn't see past your own rifle barrel. Radio was useless. We were trying to pull back to a safe line when someone, God knows who, saw movement through the dust and opened up. Couple more joined in. In that kind of mess, one trigger pull turns into a dozen. Did you see who fired the round that hit my father?" Grady stopped pacing. His eyes were steady, but there was a shadow behind them. "I saw the muzzle flash. And I saw Miller take it. He went down on one knee, got back up, waved us to keep moving, never said a damn word about it." "Why didn't you report it?" Grady gave a humorless laugh. "Report it to who? The CO who'd already told us to keep our mouths shut? The brass who were more interested in clean numbers than messy truths? You think anyone wanted to write friendly fire in the victory reports?" Rachel leaned forward. "Do you know who pulled the trigger?" He hesitated. "Yeah, I know. And if you're smart, you'll stop right there. Why? Because the man's not just some grunt who went home and disappeared. He stayed in, climbed the ladder, has friends in places that make people disappear for less than what you're asking about." Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears. "Tell me anyway." Grady studied her for a long moment. "Your old man wouldn't want me to—" He made his peace with it, if you can call living with a bullet in your spine peace. But he didn't go chasing ghosts. "You start pulling at this thread, you might not like what unravels." "I'm not him," she said. "And I'm not stopping." Grady exhaled through his nose, then walked to a small desk in the corner. He pulled open a drawer, took out an envelope, and set it on the table between them. "That's a copy of my field notes from that week. Don't ask me why I kept them. Inside is a name, a unit number, and the coordinates of where we were when the shot was fired. That's all I'm giving you." Rachel picked up the envelope, feeling the brittle weight of the paper inside. As she stood to leave, Grady said, "For what it's worth, your father was the toughest man I ever saw. Storm like that, round in the back, and he kept moving. I've never forgotten it." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint scent of the sea. Rachel walked to her car with the envelope clutched in her hand. Somewhere in those coordinates and that name was the truth her father had been carrying alone for 30 years. Rachel didn't open the envelope until she was back in her hotel room. The door bolted, the curtains drawn against the drifting Carolina dusk. She sat on the edge of the bed, the packet in her lap. For a long moment she just stared at it, feeling the way the paper shifted under her fingertips, knowing that whatever was inside could not be unseen. When she finally broke the seal, the scent of old paper rose faintly. Inside were 2 folded pages, one lined sheet torn from a small notebook, the other a photocopy of a hand-drawn map. The first page was headed February 25, 1991, Al-Jara Sector, Sandstorm. Below that, in a tight block of writing, shot fired from 2nd Platoon Bravo Company. Rifle ID'd by position and flash pattern. Shooter, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Hensley, then 1 Stone LT. Multiple witnesses, no verbal acknowledgement. Miller hit between shoulder blades, non-fatal. Miller signaled to keep moving. Orders from CO, no casualties, no reports. Rachel read the name twice, then a third time. She'd seen it before, buried in defense news, attached to promotions and committee assignments. Hensley was now a 2-star general, serving at the Pentagon, often quoted on national security. Her pulse picked up. If she took this public, it would ignite everything from military PR to congressional hearings, and it would put her squarely in the path of a man who, as Grady had warned, had the kind of connections that could shut her down fast. She set the page aside and studied the second, a rough sketch of their unit's positions that day, the wind direction marked in jagged arrows, a notation in the corner, visibility, 510 Hungarian forints. Radio unreliable. The coordinates matched the reports she'd found online. Rachel sat back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. She thought of Evans's guarded eyes, of Grady's warning, of her father in the hospital bed, still carrying the weight of that day in the set of his shoulders. By the time she drove back to Bethesda, she'd decided she needed to hear the rest from him. She found David sitting by the window, sunlight pooling on the floor at his feet. His posture was straighter than it had been in weeks, though the fatigue still lingered in his face. "I went to see Grady," she said, taking the chair beside him. His eyes shifted from the window to her. "I figured you might—" She handed him the page with Hensley's name. "He says this is who fired the shot." David read it once, then folded it neatly and set it on the windowsill. "Sounds about right." "That's it?" Rachel asked. "You've known all along?" He was quiet for a moment. "The second that round hit me, I knew it came from behind. I knew who was on that flank. But in a storm like that, with men half blind and scared, it could have been me pulling that trigger if our positions were reversed. You could have reported it. I could have destroyed a man's career, maybe more than one. And for what? I walked out of there. Plenty didn't walk out of that war at all. I wasn't about to spend the rest of my life reliving 30 seconds in the desert so someone else could pin a medal to the man who exposed friendly fire." Rachel leaned forward. "That's not just about you, Dad. It's about truth." He gave her a long, measured look. "Truth's a tricky thing. Sometimes it's a knife, sometimes it's a bandage. You have to know which one you're handing someone before you give it to them." She let that sit between them, the hum of hospital machinery filling the silence. "I'm not telling you what to do," he said finally. "If you think the world needs to know, then you do it. But don't pretend it won't cost you, and maybe me too." Rachel looked out at the courtyard, where a pair of nurses were helping an elderly veteran walk slow laps under the pale sun. Somewhere in that space between justice and consequence, she knew she'd have to make a choice, and the name in her pocket felt heavier by the second. Rachel's decision crystallized 2 days later, over morning coffee in the Fisher House kitchen. A local news segment was playing on the mounted TV, a ribbon cutting at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. Among the speakers listed, Lieutenant General Raymond Hensley. The announcer said it would be open to the public. She didn't need to think twice. By noon, she was in a rental car headed south toward Quantico, the GPS counting down the miles. The museum's glass and steel atrium gleamed under a bright spring sun, its spire cutting the sky like a bayonet. The parking lot was already half full, families with kids in strollers, veterans in ball caps, young Marines in dress blues. Inside, the main hall smelled faintly of new construction and polished wood. Displays of weapons, photographs, and field gear lined the walls. A small stage had been set up under the towering ceiling, flanked by flags. Rachel took a seat 3 rows from the front, close enough to see the detail in the medals on Hensley's chest when he stepped up to the podium. His voice was steady, carrying the polished confidence of a man who'd spent decades commanding rooms. And to the men and women who've worn this uniform, he was saying, "We owe more than thanks. We owe our continued service, in whatever form it takes." Rachel's hands tightened in her lap. She waited until the applause ended and the meet and greet began. Hensley stepped down from the stage, flanked by 2 aides. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to shaking hands and remembering names. When he turned toward her row, Rachel stood. "General Hensley," she said. He looked at her, eyes flicking briefly to the press badge Emily had loaned her for cover. "Ma'am, you with the media?" "Not exactly." She stepped closer. "Rachel Miller. My father is David Miller. Al-Jara Sector, February 25, 1991. For just a heartbeat, his expression shifted, barely. But she saw it. Recognition. "I'm afraid I don't recall the name," he said, the words smooth but just a little too quick. "You should," Rachel replied. "You fired the round that hit him." The aides stiffened. One glanced toward security. Hensley's smile thinned but didn't vanish. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Miller. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. Witnesses. Notes, coordinates. And now you standing here pretending you don't remember?" His gaze hardened, the public warmth cooling into something else. "Walk with me," he said. He led her toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from cameras and autograph seekers. His voice dropped low. "You don't know what you're playing with. That day was chaos. Half my men couldn't see past their own rifles. If I pulled the trigger, and I'm not saying I did, it was at a silhouette in a sandstorm, not a name and rank. My father lived with your bullet in his back for 30 years, and your father chose not to drag it into the light," Hensley said. "That should tell you something about the kind of man he is, and the kind of man I am. It tells me he was willing to carry pain so you wouldn't have to carry shame." For the first time, Hensley's jaw tightened. "You want to make this public?" Do it, but it won't end the way you think. The people you'll hurt aren't wearing stars. They're the men who were there, who will be dragged through hearings, the ones who'll have their names smeared for a mistake made in a war most Americans barely remember. Rachel held his gaze. Maybe they should remember. He studied her for a long beat, then said, "You're your father's daughter. Stubborn enough to get yourself hurt. Think hard before you take another step." With that, he turned and walked away, his aides closing in around him. Rachel stood in the shadow of a display case, her pulse hammering, the general's words echoing in her ears. She'd come here for confrontation, but what she'd gotten was something else, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. She wasn't sure yet whether she'd pick it up. Rachel drove back to Bethesda under a sky the color of gunmetal, the road ahead blurred by a thin misting rain. The museum confrontation replayed in her head in fragments, Hensley's guarded eyes, the warning in his tone, the unspoken dare in his final words. When she reached the hospital, she found David sitting in the recliner by the window, a blanket over his legs. He looked up as she entered, reading her face before she'd said a word. "You saw him," he said. "I did." She took the chair across from him. He didn't deny it. Not really. He just wrapped it in excuses about the storm, about protecting his men. "And then he told me if I go public, I'll hurt more people than I'll help." David was quiet, his gaze drifting to the courtyard outside. "That's not entirely wrong. I don't care if it's wrong or right," Rachel said. "I care that you were shot by your own and nobody ever admitted it." He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "Rach, I made my peace with that a long time ago." "That's the thing," she said, leaning forward. "You made peace. But it wasn't just yours to make. Every man out there who's still carrying something like this, maybe they didn't get that choice." He opened his eyes again, studying her. "You're thinking about justice. I'm thinking about survival. You drop this into the world, it's not going to land neatly. It's going to blow sideways, take people with it, twist until it's not even the truth anymore." "Maybe," she admitted, "but maybe it forces people to see what's been buried." David's jaw worked slowly, like he was weighing something heavy. Then he said, "If you do it, don't do it for me. Do it because you're ready to live with whatever comes after." The rain outside had thickened, streaking the glass in long silver lines. Rachel sat with that for a moment, the quiet between them stretching, filled only by the low hum of the heater. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The contact was already open, Emily Chen. David watched her thumb hover over the call button. "Once you start, you can't pull it back." She looked at him, seeing the years etched into his face, the scars you couldn't photograph. "I know." Her thumb pressed down. Emily picked up on the second ring. "I'm ready," Rachel said. "We run it. All of it. Grady's notes, the ballistics, the names. You can protect sources, but the story goes out." When she hung up, David gave a small nod. Not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. "Then I guess we see where the chips fall." Outside, the rain began to ease, a pale light breaking through the clouds. Rachel stood, moving to the window beside him. For a moment they watched it together. The courtyard, the wet pavement, the slow return of color to the day. Whatever came next, she knew would change everything. And for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of it alone. Sometimes the scars we can't see weigh more than the ones we can. David carried his in silence for 30 years, not because he was weak, but because he thought protecting others mattered more than clearing his own name. Maybe there's someone in your life doing the same, carrying a truth they've never spoken. Picture this: a father and daughter, side by side at a hospital window, watching the rain fade and the light return. No words, just the quiet understanding that some burdens are lighter when they're shared. So I'll ask you, what's the truth you've been carrying, and who do you trust enough to tell? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the one that gives someone else the courage to speak. And if this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, so you'll be here the next time we open another chapter together.